tensions or relationships which are normally only seen in the Yale ball in football games or on the famous football a cappella singing concert. It's actually a great experience. This is a research seminar, and so I use this opportunity to basically divide my presentation into two parts. One is to update you on some recent research I have been doing with a large number of colleagues, many of them here in the United States, under the auspices of the Global Energy Assessment, where we tried to provide a systemic assessment of energy technology innovation. And I quickly run you through this with the basic objective to say that our innovation efforts are insufficient to address the daunting challenges ahead of us for a massive transformation of the energy system that is needed from a climate change perspective. In the second part of the presentation, and apologies for that, I will move to a relatively arcane technical subject, and that's the measurement of transitions. This is research which is ongoing. There is not yet a paper published, so I'm particularly interested in your feedbacks and criticisms because that's very dear to my heart. I'm working on this and try to wrap my mind around this problem. So let us start with the background. What do we know about the relationship between technological innovation and climate change? Well, very simple slide fact. We know that we need major technological transformations if we take any reasonable climate target like the 2-degree target seriously. We're not talking about 6-degree targets, we're talking about 2-degree targets. And under these targets, we need a massive transformation of the energy system to the year 2050 already. Clearly, there are people, actors involved in this space who call for much more rigorous and faster timelines. But 2050 is basically a time frame which the models indicate, and some people who are very concerned about climate change would like to proceed much faster. So in the best case of the world, we have 40 years to do this transition. These 40 years compared to the historical record of major energy transitions, in which these transitions have taken anywhere between 80 to 130 years at the global level. So if you rely on historical dynamics and historical leverages of innovation and policies, we won't be fast enough. In addition, we are, contrary to popular perception, actually not in an ideal position to initiate this transition or to work on this transition. Despite some progress, we have very unfavorable baselines. Basically, we have a structural change stasis in the global energy system as a long-term legacy of the energy crisis of the 1970s. And secondly, as I will try to illustrate, we have a lot of problems with our innovation systems in the energy space. But there is a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the pessimism of the slow rates of change in energy systems comes from a perspective that we look at these systems from the wrong end of the spectrum. We look at how much energy goes into the system, and this changes very slowly. Perhaps we also should look how much services and utility these energy services provide as an output of the system. That's what I'm trying to do in the second half. Okay, so how would transitions look like? So this is an illustrative scenario that has emerged from the activities in Chapter 17 of the Global Energy Assessment. Basically, people use integrated assessment models, and you look at historical trends, and then you contrast the historical trends with future projections of energy scenarios. So here, and this is the innovative aspect, which I think is specific to this transition pathway analysis, is that you do not have only a few set of scenarios, you have many. You have over 40 different scenarios. That sounds very complicated, but it is necessary to assess the realisticness and the robustness of these transition options vis-a-vis to innovation failure. Because all of these transition pathways require innovations. They require innovations obviously on the supply side. Think about CCS, think about renewable options. But these innovations also entail a lot of demand side innovations. And we also know from the history of technological change and innovation that not all innovations that are proposed or experimented will make it ultimately to the market. proverb in our field is 5% of the innovations make it ultimately to the market. So human innovation systems have about the same rate of efficiency as biology. They're also about 5% of biological mutations ultimately survive in the system. What you have here are so-called knockoff scenarios. So you have combinations in which we exclude certain options. Okay? So one of these scenarios, for instance, is called no nuclear and CCS. So this is a scenario in which you reach a 2-degree climate target without relying on nuclear and without relying on carbon capture and sequestration. And the scenario tells you that this is possible under the condition that you're in this Gaia efficiency world. That means that you're very, very efficient in terms of managing energy demand growth and making the energy system much more efficient. Let's contrast this now with the Gaia supply case. So here we are much less successful in energy efficiency improvements. The energy demand grows much more faster. And you see, we no longer have this large flexibility or tolerance to innovation failure. The number of scenarios that is still consistent with a 2-degree target is significantly reduced, particularly in those scenarios where we have relatively little innovation in transportation. So, basic conclusion from the scenario literature is, if we want to achieve climate stabilization and transition into future energy systems, we need to understand that we need supply-side innovation, and above all, we need a lot of energy end-use innovation that improves the efficiency of energy systems. The more successful we are with energy end-use innovation, the more flexibility we have on the supply side. That means we can do without some options. And if you're not successful in energy end-use innovation, if we do not follow through energy end-use innovation and efficiency, then the answer is we'll need everything, but we know already a priori that not everything will work. So that means we set ourselves up of not being able to meet our ambitious climate targets. The previous slides have shown you the future projections contrasted with the history. So this is the historical record now recast, and it shows you graphical representation which we have first presented in a major study together with the World Energy Council, the WEC, 1995 and 1998, and updated. So this is now all on the web. And this is actually a teaching resource that some of you might want to look at. It's called energyprimer.org, and it's an introductory text on understanding energy systems. So here we have the primary energy input into the energy system. And as you see, the growth rate of these primary energy inputs is different, and that leads to structural change, and that leads to the famous energy transitions. You have here little symbols. And these little symbols are our fig leaves. Because we have added these symbols, steam engines, electric motors, gasoline engines, vacuum tube, commercial aviation, television, microchips, and the internet, to signal that these transitions in primary energy inputs are not driven by primary energy, but are driven by innovations in the way how we use energy, the technologies that use energy. It is the steam engine that has driven the coal economy of the 19th century, and it is the gasoline car and petrochemicals that have driven the rise of the oil industry in the 20th century. But because we didn't have the data, we only showed you primary energy inputs. And the symbols here are just as a warning or indicator that we actually wanted to look at something else, but we didn't have the data to do so. And today will be an opportunity. So this is the structural change by fuel source. We can aggregate this into three large categories: traditional biomass, coal, and modern fuels, to represent the phase out of pre-industrial energy systems that still persist for 3 billion people today, the phasing of steam and coal, saturating around the 1920s, and finally the rise of more modern energy and associated technologies. The historical dynamics range between 80 years, phase out of coal and phasing of modern energy carriers, and 130 years phase in and coal and phase out of traditional chemicals. So these are the classical historical market dynamics at the global level. What you also see is that everything has changed with the energy crisis of the 1970s. All of these structure change processes have moved into a stasis. So basically everything stays the same. And the reasons why it stays the same is that we have intervened massively into the system, but in an inconsistent, contradictory, non-aligned way. So it's push and pull all over the way. We push in renewables, we subsidize fossils, we try to innovate across the entire spectrum, and as a result, the system is entirely confused and doesn't change at all. So we have set ourselves up into a stagnation and stasis, and now we want to move into a very rapid transition to be consistent with climate change targets. So that's the first basic unfavorable baseline characteristic I mentioned. The second one is my argument today that our innovation system is highly deficient to respond to the challenges of massive and rapid transformations consistent with climate change. How do you assess innovation systems? Well, that was the subject of our chapter, and we grappled for a couple of years to come up with a kind of framework. So you want to understand how technologies change and find widespread market appeal. That's what we need. It's only if a technology is used widely that it will influence emissions. A technology in the lab is great as a showcase, but it has no impact on emissions. In order to generate innovation and improvements in technology, you need better knowledge. So we need an expanded knowledge base. We need the people and the institutions that are the holders and the ones that provide the incentive structures for our search of knowledge. So the carriers of knowledge are people and institutions. And institutions and institutional settings like incentive structures also dictate the resource mobilization which is required to bring a technology to market. And the basic idea of this framework is, as you develop a technology to widespread market adoption, you need a strengthening of all of these fundamental components of the innovation system. You need a strengthening and a growing knowledge base. You need an ever-strengthened actor base and strengthened institutions, and you need ever more and larger resources to be mobilized. R&D is cheap, market deployment is very expensive in terms of investment. And you need to think about the market deployment incentives if you think about R&D already in the first place. So I give you a few examples. So this is what is one of the outcome indicators of innovations, is how do characteristics of technologies improve. So this is a very iconic and frequently used representation of technology dynamics in which the specific costs, these are investment costs or output costs of energy technologies, change with cumulative capacities installed. So that's a so-called learning curve formulation. Okay? So the basic idea is the more you install, the more you experiment, the lower the costs. So that's the theory. And this is very well attested in manufacturing technologies, but energy technologies are somehow a little bit different. So we see cases in which we have continuous improvement, PV modules, but we also see cases in which we have negative improvement, so negative learning, not positive learning. So the more we build, the more expensive the technology becomes. This is the case, for instance, for nuclear in France and in the United States, and it's also the case for Brazilian atom. So how do we understand that some technologies learn something more than others and some technologies unlearn? Well, it's a very complex story, but for the purposes of today, I offer you a very simplistic kind of interpretation. We look at the wrong thing. Technologies do not learn by a cumulative capacity, because if you look at the cost versus cumulative installed capacity, you confound the effects of economies of scale of larger technologies with the effects of learning by doing proper. So that means we need to look at the costs not per cumulative capacity, but simply by the number of cumulative units which we have. So this is a sample of two groups of technologies, energy supply technologies in red and energy end-use technologies in green. The mean learning rate between these two samples is significantly different. On average, energy end-use technologies show twice the rate of cost improvements per doubling of cumulative capacity numbers. So 20% learning rate as opposed to 10% learning rate for supply technologies. And the reason is also shown here. For energy end-use technologies, on average, we produce 1 billion units. So we have 1 billion possibilities to experiment, to improve, and to learn. And for the supply side technologies, because they're very large scale, on average we only produce 10,000 of them. So we have 10,000 experiments as opposed to 1 billion experiments. And because of that, we learn less on energy supply than we learn on energy end-use. On top of that, the learning experiments in end-use technologies, because they're smaller scale, is also much cheaper. And so therefore you don't mind to experiment. If you use $2 million, fine, it's okay. If you lose $20 billion, think about ITER, the prototype fusion reactor. If that doesn't work out, we have lost $20 billion for a single R&D experiment. So the risk of innovation is also decidedly different. So the difference between these end-use and supply technologies can be captured in the concept of granularity. Granular technologies are great for innovation because they allow a lot and cheap experimentation and possibilities for learning. And large-scale, lumpy supply-side technologies exactly exhibit the opposite kind of pattern. Let us move now to the next dimension of innovation systems. These are actors and institutions. Perhaps the most dynamic aspect in terms of the energy actor space is the emergence of the BRICS as major innovation actors. When you look at total R&D budgets in the energy space, so this is public sector and private sector combined, the BRIC countries, so China, Russia, India, etc., are already approaching the OECD countries in terms of their R&D expenditures. So $20 billion per year compared to close to $25 billion in the OECD, and their share is increasing rapidly. So these are the new innovation actors that invest a lot into R&D, and we see the outcomes or outputs of this R&D in terms of papers and publications and patents. So we have new knowledge that is generated in the BRIC countries, but internationally, institutionally, we have no way of integrating that knowledge into the global knowledge base because we have not found a mechanism of technology collaboration. The only institutional global mechanism we have for that are the technology collaboration agreements under the International Energy Agency in Paris. So this gives you all international technology collaboration agreements, and by number of participants, OECD countries in light blue and BRIC countries in dark blue. And you see immediately that the BRIC countries are significantly underrepresented. So institutionally, we have set up technology collaboration in such a way that we maximize the exclusion of the BRIC countries, precisely those countries that are the new powerhouses in generating innovation knowledge. And that's a mismatch that needs to be addressed. Because for knowledge management, this is an educational institution. We all know that we want to maximize spillovers. We don't want to sit on our knowledge. We want to share it with our colleagues and our students. That drives our collective knowledge base further up. Last but certainly not least, resource mobilization. The innovation business is very expensive, costs a lot of money. And here we have looked at the resource mobilization, not the entire resource mobilization, but the resource mobilization that is structured by public policies. So either direct government R&D, or niche market deployment incentives like feed-in tariffs or renewable portfolio standards. So these are the classical policy instruments. So we count all the dollars that are mobilized through these government policies, through the different phases of the technology life cycle, from R&D all the way to diffusion and ultimate phase-out, and through the components of the energy system from end-use, conversion, and resource extraction. Obviously, you see a very heterogeneous picture. There are a lot of different blobs up here, or boxes. But the most important findings is the mismatch between what happens here in energy end use at the front end of the innovation cycle, where we mobilize only approximately $10 billion, for an industry that invests typically $3,000 billion every year. Energy end-use investments, buildings, cars, is $3 trillion a year, but we only spend $10 billion to develop the new technologies that might lead ultimately to climate-friendly diffusion investments for these technologies. So end-use is marginalized. When we look at supply, also here the situation is quite interesting. We have an extremely narrow portfolio. We basically have three technologies: wind and PV and electricity generation, and biofuels, first generation biofuels. Here we spend on average approximately $150 billion per year to bring this technology further to market. But this $150 billion of pushing a technology into the market pale in comparison to the $500 billion which we spend every year to subsidize, to keep the incumbent fossil fuels in the system. So how much sense does it make to push this $150 billion new technology into the market and keep the existing technologies with $500 billion in the market? So the conclusion from an Austrian is we need Schumpeterian gains of creative destruction. Need policies for Schumpeterian gains of creative destruction, and the first policy step is, of course, the abandonment of fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, so this is the basic perspective which we have derived from the global energy assessment, and basically the perspective is not positive. In view of the challenge, our current innovation system has significant underinvestment, portfolio biases, and misalignment of incentives, policy priorities. And these need to be addressed before we can move forward. So the basic conclusion is we need a new technology, a new ecosystem, a new innovation ecosystem, a new technology to produce innovation. And that technology remains to be designed in a much more systemic and consistent way. Okay, let's move now to the second part of the seminar, and where I would like to share with you some recent results on measuring this kind of transition. I've shown you a previous example in terms of primary energy input. So this is an example of an output measure of the energy system. It's the amount of energy services, transport, low temperature heat, high temperature heat, light, petrochemical feedstocks, and the measure here is useful energy. It's a very specific measure that is characteristic for the energy system and which is very handy because it's a commensurable measure across these many different energy end uses and services that energy provides. Okay. This data comes from a new database which we have developed at IIASA. It's posted on the website, and the database was implemented by one of my former students, Simon de Sterke. Documentation is also available, and I'm happy to accept any comments and feedback once you have looked at the data and you have questions on it. What the basic idea is, you measure the energy system at different levels: primary energy, final energy, useful energy. You measure the energy system in terms of energy flows, or you measure the energy system in terms of exergy flows, and you measure the system by end-use sector, by end-use service, by sector, and by fuel. So that means you can aggregate balances any way you like with this database because it's optimistic. And so therefore I think it's a good research. So this is how the world energy system looks like when we look at terms of primary, final, and useful exergy, not energy. Okay? And we have different growth rates. Okay? We understand that useful exergy is the lowest exergetic flows because of the subsequent conversion efficiencies. So as we go from primary exergy to final exergy, we have a lot of losses. Think about the electricity generating plants. And if we go from final exergy to useful exergy, we have even more losses. Think about all of the thermal losses of an internal combustion engine car, that's 75% of it. But more importantly is to look at the different growth rates. Useful exergy has grown by a factor of 60 since 1900, and primary energy has grown only by a factor of 60, and final energy by a factor of 11. The differential growth rates indicate to us that by measuring the dynamics of a system in terms of input, we actually might miss much of the growth story. And that's something which economists have been very apt to remind us. In particular, my Yale colleague Bill Nordhaus did a beautiful study on the history of lighting that precisely contextualized these measurement biases in economics. By measuring inputs, we miss the big picture, what happens in terms of output, in terms of utility, in terms of consumer benefit. Because we only look at the input, we don't look at the output. And the energy system is a classical case for this. This is an example from the United Kingdom using the same sector or example that Nordhaus did. This is the example of lighting. So this is how lighting costs have increased. That's how primary energy inputs have increased. And that's how much lighting services in lumen hours has increased. So by measuring inputs, you get this picture. But actually by measuring output, you get this picture. Much more dynamic and much more rapid growth in the energy service provision. The reason for this growth and these differential growth rates is, of course, technological change. We have here the relative shares of different lighting technologies, starting all the way from whale oil, candles, town gas, and electricity. And you see also that the dynamics of technological change accelerate. Phase out of whale oil, 120-60 years. Phase in of electricity and phase out of town gas, only delta T of 25 years. So do we see here historical acceleration? No. We see an acceleration simply as a testimony of the relative advantage. So candles that replaced whale oil were not so much better. And so therefore this replacement process took 130 years. Electricity replacing town gas was fabulous. And so, because of the considerable higher comparative advantage of electricity, this transition process proceeded very fast. Little sidekick on the integrated assessment community. Where are output characteristics in innovation included in any of the models? They're ignored. All of the technological change in the models that help to structure our climate policy discourse is structured by the cost of inputs. The cost of fossil fuels or the cost of carbon, because that's measured at input. Nobody ever talks how the cost of climate mitigation look in relationship to the benefits which we might get from clean technologies. And I do not mean only health benefits, the other co-benefits which were well documented, but I look at other benefits. What's the benefit of an iPhone? In compare, but we never discuss it. We only discuss the iPhone in terms of its electricity bill and its carbon footprint. And that's actually not a very, very useful perspective when we try to understand an iPhone. I mean, I see Mark here, I have to mention iPhones, because iPhones, from a global equity perspective, it's the most democratic technology which we have. iPhones have outcompeted bicycles and radios, which were the traditional examples of technologies that were accessible to almost any family on the planet, rich or poor. Now, cell phone is that. It's the only technology that is accessible basically to everybody on the planet, or about to be accessible to everybody on the planet. So we need to understand. Okay, let's now go here again back to the measurement issues. I show you here two countries, not completely inconsequential. US and China, the two largest energy consuming countries and largest CO2 emitters. And this shows you the structural evolution of the primary energy input, so the traditional measure. Okay? So we see the phase out of traditional biomass in the US, much later in China, the phase in of coal in China, already phased out of coal in the United States, and finally the phasing of modern energy carriers in China and the US. So the comparison is one of lags. I can give you a single number that can compare China and the United States, and that number is 1926. In terms of energy inputs, China today looks exactly like the US looked in 1926. So we have a time lag of almost 90 years. That time lag is persisting. Good luck for China. Okay. Let's now move to the next level. Okay, so we have now measured energy at the level of primary energy inputs. We can also measure it at the level of final energy. So primary energy is commodities, unprocessed. Final energy are final fuel sold to consumers. And finally, we have useful energy. That's the last form of energy which we can measure before we actually deliver a service. And we can measure energy systems. I do it now for the carbon intensity at the level of primary energy, final energy, useful energy. Obviously, we lose energy and emissions in going from one step to the next. And so we also want to account for these losses. And so that's actually the transformation sector. So that's our refineries and electric power plants. This is again the comparison of the US and China since 1900 at these different levels of measuring and carbon intensities. First important conclusion is that we need a secondary axis. Useful energy needs to be separated separately. The conversion losses are so large that actually in terms of carbon intensity we need to multiply by a factor of approximately 4 in order to make it comparable with the other carbon intensity. Second important conclusion is we have improvements, and the improvements get larger the closer we are to the output of the system. So decarbonization is very rapid in terms of useful energy, look at China or even the US, as compared to decarbonization in terms of primary energy inputs. And on top of that, the conversion sector is actually moving in the opposite direction. So here we have an interesting kind of dichotomy. Consumers, end users, increasingly dislike the carbon atom, but the energy sector increasingly likes the carbon, which suggests that we need different regulatory ideas and instruments to attack these two different kinds of categories much more vigorously. A uniform carbon tax will not do the trick. We can now look at another level. We can look now at different forms and energy contained. So solid energy forms, liquids or grids. This is the example for the United Kingdom. And just to flag to you that an input versus an output perspective yields a different result. So in terms of inputs, grids expand only at a snail pace of 92 years and have a market share currently 48%. But when we look at outputs, the dynamics is 65 years, so much faster, and the share is 64%. Why we have this acceleration in increasing output shares? The reason is the efficiency. So the closer we go to the end use, the more the efficiency of clean energy carriers like electricity play out. We can do now similar comparisons across many countries. This is just a sample of a few countries. And the interesting finding, that's preliminary, we need to do more tests, more countries, more measures and indicators. But up to now, we have not found a single case in which the output measure was slower than the input measure. Throughout, the output measures of structure change in the energy system are faster when we measure outputs of the system as opposed to inputs of the system. See that the mean difference is approximately 22% when we look at solid fuels, and the mean difference is 36% when we look at grids, with some big variations across countries. So in some ideal cases, when you look, for instance, at Japan, the end-use perspective is actually more than twice as fast. So perhaps Arnulf's pessimism arising from this 25 years of past work of trying to measure energy transitions is wrong, because I've measured the wrong thing, because I didn't have better data. Now we have better data, and we can start to think about measuring the real thing. Okay. So this is my last quantitative slide. I return to the discussion of the US comparison to China. And here we measure an output. These are the relative market shares in useful energy provision that we obtain by oxidizing carbon, by oxidizing hydrogen, or by using the electron. We have three basic fundamental mechanisms to generate energy. So either use electrons, or oxidize carbon, or oxidizing hydrogen. The interesting thing is, look here at electrons. That's the most prized form of energy delivery of useful energy services. It's very efficient, it's clean at the point of end use, it's convenient, there is no environmental nuisance. And China and the US are at par. So the lag, which we previously discussed of more than 90 years, is actually perhaps again a result of an inappropriate measurement of what the system does. By measuring what the system actually delivers in terms of output. Actually, the lag is in some aspects not that big, doesn't exist for electricity, and the lag is persistent in terms of the hydrogen and carbon composition, which suggests that the way how the Chinese provide energy services to the consumers has this too much the possibility of natural gas, because that's basically 4 hydrogen per 1 unit of carbon. So therefore, because gas is lacking, that's why these two indicators lag behind each other. So that's the basic conclusion for today. Hopefully, I have convinced you that it's interesting to look at this output perspective. It's the beginning of a longer road, so I look forward to your feedback and criticisms. And the basic policy implication for you is that our policy targets are ill-advised if they're exclusively focused on inputs. Primary energy intensity of the economy, primary carbon intensity of the economy, these are all inappropriate measures. You should actually fix policy targets at the output level. At least at the level of final energy, because at the level of final energy we have good international statistics. Useful energy, believe the IIASA numbers, okay, so I will not recommend this in the policy space. But in final energy, and you might also want to separate policy targets specifically from end use, so that means types of energy and technologies used by consumers, from policy targets at the conversion side, at the transformation sector, because these two sectors operate very, very differently, and lumping them together under a joint target is not very, very meaningful. We want to track progress in these two sectors separately. And in doing so, we should have, this now resonates again more with the conclusion of the first part of the talk, we need to focus much more on the energy efficiency and end-use innovations and high exergy carriers such as electrification and ultimately hydrogen as a strategy to address the climate change challenge. I stop here. I'm sorry I took a little bit too long, longer than planned, but I hope we still have 15 minutes for discussion.
The floor is open for discussion. Any questions?
I thought this was very helpful, and what I'm about to suggest is about where I'm coming from. So I've been thinking a lot about institutions in terms of policy making. I was wondering, I know Japan, like after the 1970s, made a governmental institutional choice which really aims at efficiency. So our institutions, which we compare across countries, are going to be critical if we're going to focus more on the end use. I wonder if at some point that might be something someone would take into account in this type of different, thing.
I would love to report to you that somebody takes into account, but unfortunately not.
Not yet.
After 25 years of international negotiations, we have an international renewable energy. But also that renewable energy agency is completely missing. And that really emerges in different national settings as well. End use efficiency and is very, very hard to do because we don't have yet a coalition, a coalesced actor network. We have lobbying bodies, very powerful one in the biomass sphere, in the wind energy, in the photovoltaic sphere. We have no equivalent lobbying mobilization or active network mobilization in energy efficiency and end use. And I think this is a big problem. We understand the reasons for it. It's very dispersed. We have so many different technologies. The symbolic value of the megawatt of not consuming something cannot be compared to the symbolic value of consuming something. A fuel-efficient car is not attractive. A hydrogen Hummer vehicle, Arnold Schwarzenegger, my fellow countrymen, is of course much more symbolic and attractive. So we need to address that. The examples which we have, indeed, are examples from Japan, where we have a kind of actor mobilization. Now, of course, this requires specific organizational settings which are not amenable in different countries. In the US, you cannot have the same systems in Japan. But I think it's very interesting to remind ourselves that when the energy crisis hit, the Japanese started two very massive energy programs. One was the Sunshine program, and the other one was the Moonshine program. Moonshine was on energy efficiency, and Sunshine was on energy supply. So this duality, the policies need to address both, were always intrinsically embedded in the Japanese institutional policy landscape. So interesting. Second one is that the Japanese are very good, because of cultural reasons, to bring public and private sector actors together in an informal way. The most successful example of energy efficiency programs, which we have discussed in the Global Energy Assessment, is the top runner appliance efficiency standard in Japan, which is basically a kind of standard setting through an iterative negotiation process between government and industry. Very interesting model, not easily replicable somewhere else, but a model where we can learn. And the basic message from the Japanese model is we want to set standards dynamically, not keeping one standard for 30 years, like the CAFE standard here in the United States. And you want to use the standard setting as a mechanism to reward innovations. So if you're a company in Japan, your energy efficient model is picked as top runner, that means it sets the standard for everybody else in 5 years down the road, you have an enormous competitive advantage. So here, technology standards, dynamic and rewarding innovations is the essence in the Japanese model. Okay. And that might be transferable. The Japanese model of name and shame, it means if you're non-compliant, the only thing the government does, it publishes your name in the newspaper. I don't think this will work in Austria or even the United States. So that's specific Japanese. But dynamics and innovation rewards built into the dynamic standards that we might be transferable. Unfortunately, it's one of the few successful examples which we can report.
This isn't really a question for the comment, but my name is Joanna Bryson, and I'm at the Center for Information Technology Policy here. And so one of the things that we worry about, I do with AI and robots, is economic. And I just ran into someone, I've actually emailed you both before those names down, doing exactly the same kind of thing you're trying to do, looking at the outcomes of, for example, iPhones, in terms of economic productivity, because he thought, well, basically, that the outcomes for how our lives is changing is not being adequately measured. So that maybe some of this technological unemployment or underemployment is actually not quite what it looks like. So it's also this concern about measures. So I'm wondering a little bit, but I'm trying to say that this is, I think you're absolutely on the right tack for handling climate change and sustainability, not only because of the energy, but also for getting people to think better about their lives and their own ambitions. So there's a lot of affordances here that once you start thinking about, look, what have you got, instead of saying, look, what have you not got, or maybe you have to give up. Look at the expanding the range of products you're getting.
I think this measurement issues is well recognized in innovation literature. I mean, there's a classical study done here in the US at the beginning of the year 2000 by the National Research Council on energy R&D at DOE was aversive. And it raises this idea of social returns to innovation, so what are the benefits besides market and monetary benefits. And my reading of that very classical study, I mean, there are always methodological quibbles. My reading of the study is very significant, that the social returns of innovation were always systematically several-fold larger in energy end-use innovations than in energy supply. And the reason for that is precisely what I said. When you try to grapple your head around that it's not only less energy costs that is a benefit to the consumer, but the things you can do with a computer, the things you can do with a cell phone, the things you could do, for instance, with soft mobility, sustainable transportation options, are the true benefits. If you factor them in, then the returns to an innovation are at least up to a factor of 20 or so. And it's very hard to have similar kind of social benefits in the narrow range of energy supply technologies, where basically minimizing input costs. Perhaps there's an environmental benefit.
A couple of questions there. Mark?
Yeah, so it was very interesting what you said about the bad idea of a unique carbon price. And I'd like to understand better. So if I understand you, you mean that there is different dynamic process of adjustment or speed of adaptation in various sectors. And so we would need to push some more strongly than others. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's the idea. And also the sensitivity of the sector to a carbon price is very, very different. Let's say if we would impose a carbon price of $500 per ton of CO2 to the electric utility industry, we will see very rapid and profound change. You say that's politically unacceptable? Absolutely not at all. That's what European consumers pay in terms of carbon taxes for their gasoline. That's the implied carbon tax in the European gasoline sector. So that the consumer has not decarbonized more clearly shows that the consumer is even less price sensitive. So if you want to move the consumer, perhaps you have to think about $2,000 or $3,000 on carbon taxes. This is very far remote and removed from the kind of macroeconomic price of carbon, one uniform price, assuming similar elasticities in behavior and adaptation across all different sectors and different activities, which is, of course, not what we see is the actual reality today. So splitting up consumers and power supply companies might be the first step.
Take Rocco's and then this side and then back.
So on your second bullet, you say major transitions may be feasible by 2050. I might have summarized your slides by major transitions look really hard by 2050. But perhaps you could explain why I should be more optimistic than that in just a few words.
Okay, it will be hard in any case. It might be feasible if you follow a different kind of model. Okay? And I would call this the end-use model. We focus first on end use, because we know the system is thermodynamic, and by changing the end use, we force the supply sector to follow. We have created opportunities for coal mining, not because we founded coal mining companies, but because we founded companies that produce steam engines and use steam engines. So the end-use innovation drove the supply side innovation.
So if there are questions there.
I have a quick question. I think it's really great to point out it's important to look at the final and useful energy. And I think a lot of limitation in terms of this area is how you measure the useful energy, and also if you push it further, how does it mean for people, and it's gonna vary differently across society or culture and different levels. So I just wonder how did you construct this database for the use for energy, and how you can move forward to say the indications for people's.
So a very important question, useful energy is a measurement concept that has been with the energy field for quite some time, almost 80 years. We had a very big move to ask statistical agencies to report energy use in terms of useful energy. So Eurostat produced useful energy balances in the 1980s and then stopped. And the only country that continues to provide this statistical evidence is the country of Brazil. Brazil has useful energy balances. So we have a rich statistical database of these statistics by process, by fuel. We plug this into a statistical model, and it gives us technical conversion efficiencies between finite to useful energy, and that's how the useful energy balances are constructed. And these conversion efficiencies are, of course, a function of specific environments in terms of income. Poor countries have a different technology portfolio than rich countries, and so that's also taken into account. So it's a statistical measurement model. I do not apologize for statistical measurement model because everything else is also statistical measurement model. Nobody goes out and weights the tons of coal which are reported as primary energy use. These are all statistical models. Nobody can measure the GDP. It's a measurement model. So we can do the same thing. There are uncertainties, obviously, in this, but we can try to capture these uncertainties by doing systematic sensitivity analysis.
So what do you do in that?
You spoke about the huge difference between energy production and energy consumption, 10 to the fourth versus 10 to the ninth. Now, 10 to the fourth represents a centralized command and control industrialized model that emerged almost 2 centuries ago. And now we're moving in part to a distributed, somewhat probabilistic production model with, if the regulations and restrictions are lifted, will also entail localized use and localized resale, which then means that the grid is a supplementary system, not a primary system, and has to exist in its own right with its own funding. So I would ask with regard to innovations in development, because whether that rate, given this scenario, is not going to increase to the point of significant improvements in efficiency and localized distribution that are electronically controlled, computer controlled, so as to improve the productive efficiency.
I think this is an open topic. I cannot comment on it. I haven't done research on it. My personal hunch is that these efficiency effects will be there, but not as substantial as what happens with efficiency effects in terms of energy. So distributed generation, smart grids at the residential scale will bring some margin, but the big margin will be if you move to an electric vehicle from an internal combustion vehicle, because that's an end-use efficiency improvement of a factor of 3, and the smart grid, whatever the number Siemens have come up with simulation models is 20 to 25%. So it's significant, but I still think that the holy grail in innovation systems is actually end use, and there are a lot of technologies that actually are amenable or much closer to this kind of distributed model that you have mentioned. I mean, in a smart grid distributed system, the car will be part of it.
One last question, and then we're going to thank you.
Thank you. I'm coming from California, where we have a policy called the loading order, where any new growing need needs to be first met with savings and then renewables and then natural gas. Are there any other countries that are kind of taking innovative policies to support demand side management as a first priority and then looking to other options? Or
I don't know. Massachusetts is not radically buff in
yes,
terms of energy
yes.
efficiency, but I'm not aware of this kind of rule in Massachusetts.
Okay.
So I still think California shines here much more than the other. And we have very little examples. The most famous example out in Europe, Germany, has exactly the wrong order. The wrong order is basically renewables followed by renewables, followed by renewables, and that leaves the last option, lignite, the most carbon-intensive electricity, and as a result, the more renewables we have, the more carbon emissions we have in the electricity sector. So completely wrong. Efficiency ignored, and clean fossil fuels completely ignored, left out the rank order. So
I think we agree we've heard an extraordinarily stimulating talk. Thank you very much.